Personally, I'm not a tree hugger. I'm not political.
I'm also not a tree hugger.
I'm not a tree hugger.
I'm not a tree hugger either. However, the longer I sat here, I realized I need to be here.
A lot of people out here have been saying that they ain't tree huggers. I am. I hugged one out in the parking lot. Because, it's shading my car. It's going to help me breathe tonight. So I consider myself a tree hugger.
On August 6th, the City of Lakewood, Washington released a high-quality video on their public Facebook page expounding on their tough approach to protecting the area's Garry oaks. A narrator describes Community Economic Development Director Dave Buer as a tree advocate. Wearing what appears to be a UV protective khaki shirt and sunglasses, Mr. Buer stands in filtered sunlight under the shade of tall trees and discusses what the municipality describes as existing protections for trees.
When it comes to tree preservation, we end up having two types. One is the one who blunders into having trees removed, not knowing what the rules are. And the other group is the individuals who don't care, who are very recalcitrant and just flagrantly violate the rules. In either case, because of the way the code is written, the City of Lakewood is required to go forward with enforcement, and oftentimes that means substantial fines and penalties being levied against contractors and property owners.
If you only got your news from the city's Facebook page, you might think that the government simply wanted to highlight recent conservation efforts and offer a warning to any outsiders to not mess with their trees. But if you are attending in-person Lakewood City Council meetings, you might perceive something different. This is what you hear from oak advocates if you were sitting in the City Council chambers on July 6th.
It's critical to note that Lakewood has killed many of its Garry oaks for the purpose of warehouse construction, particularly in areas that house disadvantaged populations such as Black and brown people and poor folks.
People were asking and demanding that City Council reverse the trend of warehouse development and Garry oak loss in the city.
And I'm asking y'all to change your minds, be the heroes that we all need you to be, and change your decision about this Garry oaks thing.
So what prompted Lakewood's Economic Development Director to make this video, both defending his legacy and assuring residents that everything was just fine? Heat, literal and political. I'm Michael Yadrick, the host of Tree Hugger Podcast, and I'm broadcasting from the land of the Puyallup people, otherwise known as Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. This is the show where we reimagine ecological restoration, and the episode where we do a deep dive on my local oak ecosystem. We're going to explore the intersections of urban development, environmental racism, the practice of organizing against tree loss, and the oak restoration imaginary. It starts right here. It's already started. Enjoy the episode. Its first Lushootseed name is čaʔadᶻac, aka Oregon white oak, Garry oak, or Quercus garryana. It occurs from Vancouver Island to Southern California at the 34th parallel. Oak savannas and prairies in the Willamette Valley, Puget Trough-Georgia Basin are one of the most endangered ecosystems in North America. I think I can confidently say we've lost about 85% of the oak and prairie habitat that existed in the early to mid-1800s. People have historically had a strong connection with the prairie oak ecosystem in a unique and mutually beneficial relationship. At least for 10 millennia, Native peoples needed resources provided by the oak ecosystem, like acorns, camas and other bulbs, deer and elk, shelter, and cover of the big oak trees that were essential for survival. Oak woodlands are classified as quote-unquote priority habitats according to the Washington Department of Wildlife Priority Habitats and Species Program, which covers threatened and endangered species, and habitat types or elements with unique or significant value to a large number of species. Unfortunately, this does not afford the trees direct protection exactly because the Priority Habitat Species Program has no teeth and no enforcement through the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It is just intended to act as a guidance for local jurisdictions carrying out Growth Management Act requirements in Washington state, which translates to critical areas regulations at the city level. So biologists are supposed to review priority habitat lists and avoid or mitigate priority habitat species impacts. Their plans are reviewed by local government planners and, of course, interpreted differently. While recently built warehouses of several 100,000 square feet have been constructed and don't seem to have an intended use, big money from the likes of Amazon distribution and Tesla manufacturing are fulfilling what appears to be a decades-long plan to redevelop the eastern edge of Lakewood along the Interstate 5 corridor. Smaller businesses, residential development, and utility companies are also taking advantage of land use changes that local activists, organizers, and oak advocates feel are at odds with tree preservation and environmental justice in the city. I am glad to have you hear from a variety of characters and my neighbors in this oak story happening down the road from me where conifers give way to prairies. Meet Amelia Escobedo, a veteran who served at nearby Joint Base Lewis McChord and a community organizer. She is also running for Lakewood City Council.
So when I first got stationed here at JBLM when I was in the military, I actually loved the smell. When I got off the plane and I smelled the air, it was a whole different thing. It was fresh. It was cool. The scent was beautiful. And then seeing the magnificent trees, I was like, look at these trees. Like, we don't have anything like that in Texas. So seeing these huge trees that sway. I have one that's across the street and the leaves look like it's always waving at me and shimmering. And I love that. It's called Lakewood. So you have a lot of trees and you have a lot of lakes. Being a veteran, when I go into the trees and I go back to the water, it brings me peace. Just looking at those ripples on the ocean and just listening and just calming my brain and calming my mind. I feel like everybody should have that relaxation and that peace. It's like having that peace of being silent. And you don't get that a lot. There's so much internet. There's so much chitter chatter from everything in life.
Amelia was one of a good handful of people who got up to speak during the open comment period of the first masked in-person city council meeting in over a year.
Hello, City Council members. I have seen you many times online, and I'm happy to see your faces in person. What I want to talk about today is systematic racism has consequences for all life in cities. Talking about social inequalities, specifically racism and classism, are impacting the biodiversity, evolutionary shifts, and ecology health. And because of this, fewer trees in low-income and racially minoritized neighborhoods in major cities across the U.S., less tree cover means hotter temperatures and fewer plant and animal species. Additionally, these areas tend to be closer to industrial waste or dumping sites than wealthier, predominantly white areas. A reality that was put in place intentionally through policies like redlining. Environmental racism is real, and it needs to stop. We need to save the Garry Oaks. We need to save our motherland. We need to save the earth. This is not a joke. This has been happening.
Saving trees is not the only priority for this community. Lakewood, as the second biggest city in Pierce County, is also not immune to overzealous policing like other communities. I heard this name several times in conversation over the last couple months. On May 1st, 2020, Lakewood police say čaʔadᶻac was pulled over for rolling through a stop sign. Officer Mike Wiley, who made the traffic stop, shot Joaquin after reportedly saying, "Keep your hands on your head. You're going to get shot, dude."
If you can allow the officers who are supposed to be protecting the community to take the lives of the community and not punish them for that, then the thing that's happening with the Garry Oaks doesn't surprise me at all, because a human life is very valuable. The Garry Oaks are very valuable, but despite the value of human lives and despite the value of the oxygen that we breathe, the decisions that are being made, or decisions rather that are not being made, are the ones that are affecting all of us.
Expansion of Interstate 5 and local city planning has contributed to what now is called an industrial hotspot in Lakewood by the Puget Sound Business Journal. Companies with names like Bridge Development Partners and Pacific Coast Capital Partners have purchased acres of land sites in Lakewood for billions of dollars in order to build warehouses and distribution facilities. And real estate companies like Colliers International perform the transactions. After development is endorsed by the city, companies advertise that they can throw up a warehouse in 1 year from first garryana cut to dock doors opening. Savannas Yuso is also running for city council and has been outspoken about what this sort of development will do to her community.
And I want to focus on the impact that cutting these trees down will have on the people that live here and the lives that will be directly affected. You are forcing people out of their homes, some of them who have lived in Springbrook, Tillicum, Woodbrook since the 70s, just to build warehouses that don't even have a specified use, to create warehouses that will bring more traffic and pollution from diesel truck engines, warehouses that will add to an already increasing heat index, all the while displacing people from their homes and not providing anywhere for them to go.
Siobhan and Amelia have been advocating for equitable economic development, expanding affordable housing, building no barrier entry housing for people experiencing homelessness, and respecting tribal treaties. Amelia tells us a little bit about the atmosphere of speaking up.
I think it was not this Monday, but the Monday before, and we were speaking up about the Garry Oaks, and we were speaking up about not having recreation centers for our children. And one of our tree huggers said a little curse word, and then the mayor went off and he called us the peanut gallery. So that shows how much respect he has for his constituents. So there is so much that needs to be worked on. The Corinth City Council is out of touch, and we need to make change happen. We have to be the ones that take those steps. And I'm being that voice for my children, for my family, for everybody that's going to come after me.
But she is not alone. The mayor and city council are under heat from other oak protectors. In particular, Christina Minetti is a formidable oak advocate. She toured me around town, and we caught up to chat after she testified in that first fiery in-person city council meeting. This was my first time to the Natural Resources Laboratory and Research Park at Flat Creek, owned by Clover Park Technical College, what we think is one of the largest remaining oak groves, aside from the 4,000-acre oak woodland at Joint Base Lewis McChord.
My name is Christina Minetti. I'm a Lakewood resident. I've lived here since about 1971.
Let's just explain where we are, because you took me to this magical oak grove.
When I was a kid, when we moved here, because I was really small, I was like 3 years old or so, this area used to be much more rural, of course, and where we lived, it was across the street from a farm. I used to play on the farm, and it was really nice. It was Flett Dairy Farm. So when I was a kid, we would get the milk from this dairy farm delivered to our house, and you would see cows out, and up here was part of that farm. The area at the end of it was the bull pasture, so you don't want to tangle with them. And they just had the pasture area in between the trees. So there are, I think Dr. Faust at the Clover Park Voc Tech, he told me there are 700 oak trees here.
I had no idea it existed, but I imagine a lot of this is being quote-unquote lost. So from your standpoint, do you feel like nostalgic for a time in Lakewood when things were more pure and clean and healthy and green?
Well, I'm nostalgic for a time when I didn't feel that the trees were in constant danger. I mean, Lakewood was never perfect, but when I was growing up, I didn't look at a tree and think, oh gosh, will it be there, tomorrow? I wouldn't hear chainsaws and have the impulse to run out and find out what they're cutting down, which is literally what we have. There are some days when you feel like every day you see them cutting down an oak tree, actually. Now, people have this pressure, the property prices, and they try to squeeze everything they can out of their property. So I think they want to chop it up, cut the trees down, and they can in Lakewood, because if you've got a property of less than 17,000 square feet, you don't even need a permit. Even though the city has tree preservation code that says that the Garry oaks are supposed to be protected, but not if you have a small property. It's fine. And also for Lakewood, previously they were considered to be a special aspect of Lakewood. They built the old shopping center around the trees, and it, made it elegant. But now it's like people don't even appreciate them. So it's like a complete transformation, and that's, I think, a part of the problem of what's upsetting the old Lakewood. These people who've lived in Lakewood a long time, and they remember what it was like. I mean, people even older than I am. And so they're kind of joining with us to protest this, because it's like, what happened? We used to appreciate these things, and now they're just disappearing.
It's interesting that term you used is Old Lakewood. So supposedly, I think what you mean is folks that have lived here like for decades, right? And
Right.
so
Well, I kind of invented that. I mean, I started referring to this kind of group, this milieu, as Old Lakewood, because Lakewood is really old. Well, it's not really old. We're not Europe or anything, but at the turn of the 20th century, there were rich people in Tacoma, like associated with the trains, the railroad. And so there was a little train, I think, small gauge train that would come from Tacoma to Lakewood. And this was their playground, because we have these 7 lakes here. And there was a racetrack. There was an ice skating rink. There was a golf course where I live. It was a nice, beautiful, natural space. And some of these families have been there since then.
Speaking of Old Lakewood, throughout this episode we often default to discussing settler history as the starting point of this area's history. Well, the land and waters around what is now Lakewood was inhabited by the Steilacoom Band. The Steilacoom are unrecognized by the federal government as a Native American tribe. One big feature of their territory was a group of spirit-inhabited lakes. The Steilacoom were perhaps the most affected of all western Washington tribes by early white settlement. Located within the territory was the first trading post of the Hudson's Bay Company, the first United States Army fort, the first church, the first jail, and the first incorporated town north of the Columbia River. Even Lakewood's name before was called Prairie. The Steilacoom tribe were a party to the Medicine Creek Treaty in 1854. The treaty negotiators for the United States did not place a reservation near the blossoming town of Steilacoom. Therefore, the treaty directed them into reservations established for their neighbors, the Puyallup, Nisqually, and Squaxin. So I want to say, regardless of their status in relation to the nation-state of the U.S., I did want to acknowledge the Steilacoom tribe and their efforts at self-determination and their contribution to the creation of the oak ecosystems in this area. Okay, back to my time with Christina. I got a personalized tour in her electric vehicle so she could show me what was happening with the oaks around town.
So fortunately, nothing has happened to these. These have been here since I was a kid.
Yeah, these are awesome. The library, saving the oaks.
Yeah, they want to demolish the library.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, they think it's not fit for purpose anymore.
This is the wine bar over here?
Exactly.
Is that where we're coming to? Okay.
So unfortunately, I hope I don't burst into tears or something. I don't know. They wanted a patio? Like they cut down the oak trees for a patio to drink their fancy wine? I don't really know.
Yeah. So the Amazon warehouse has already been built.
Right. 800, I think, 43,000 square feet worth of it. And so this is Mr. Robbins' house there, and his shed, like what he uses for his bees and stuff. And now he goes out of his door and he has this. He says every 10 minutes there are 3 semi-trucks. This used to be just a little dead-end thing that stopped in the playfield from the school. Gotta say hi to...
Yeah, sure.
Just say hi to Sue.
Sure.
Hi, Sue! Sue, it's just me, Christina. I'm taking somebody around. Yeah, to see the trees and stuff that they want to cut down on the other side. Bye! It is so sad, I guess, but this was in the works for a long time. Like 20 years they were plotting, to do this.
I do notice cruising through town that it's seems like west of Gravelly Lake Drive and west of Lakewood Drive, like it's much greener. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. So obviously the stuff around the lakes is a lot greener, and obviously people have more money and they have more greenery on their houses.
Just looking at the aerial image on Google, you can really see there's a line of north-south, these north-south streets. It's like green on from where we came, and moving east towards Interstate 5, it's fairly gray.
Yeah. This is not, a place full of forests and people, and of course it is a poor neighborhood, right?
Of course,
This was always a poor neighborhood, and they're not going to do it someplace where people are going to complain. They didn't even know about it here. I mean, they knew about it, but it was dragging out.
With help from her son, Christina put up a website in June of 2021. The URL is simply oak.eco, E-C-O. The website tracks a methodical, quiet pattern of oak destruction through corporate, residential, and other types of development that are directly approved via permit and approvals overseen by the City of Lakewood. Just thumbing through the website posts on July 5th, Quest/111 Street Southwest Oaks public comment due. Western State Hospital public comments due. Alpharetta Oak update. July 30th, public comments on another Woodbrook warehouse. Oakwood School / 85th Street South Oak tragedy. Next, to help unravel this story, I got some help from Brandon Drucker. Brandon is a local ecological restoration practitioner. Part of his career and passion revolves around oak prairies, and he helps to unpack some of the rules around oak protection. In particular, we were discussing the proposed development in the Springbrook neighborhood on 123rd Street, just half a mile from Joint Base Lewis McChord and the wider oak woodlands that exist there. Brandon does a deep dive on the State Environmental Policy Act checklist, which holds information that the city uses to make a determination about whether or not the development should move forward.
Yeah, so we went out to check out the site, right, that had drawn so much attention, and wanted to get eyes on it for ourselves. It was an old grove of oak trees. They were centuries old. They had huge canopies, and there's ponderosa pine present. There was manroots present. There was Oregon ash. There are all these other plant species that are part of complex Garry oak savanna community that exists across the fence. And to me, that system looked like priority habitat. Now, Christina is absolutely right that these oaks are not explicitly protected in a way that's commensurate with their value, but they are protected in the critical areas code if they can meet the definition of priority habitat.
Brandon says this definition of priority habitat is often twisted and interpreted differently by tree huggers and the consultants paid by developers alike. The first condition is to determine the size threshold. Remember, 1 acre is the magic number. So the consultants that wrote this report we were looking at just looked at the drip line of the trees and drew a line around that drip line. And of course, none of those patches based on the drip line were over 1 acre. They went from 0.3 to 0.9 acres. Just shy of the threshold, which is convenient, says Brandon, when it comes to permitting.
The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has defined priority habitat, and nowhere in their definition does it talk about the drip line of trees and using that drip line to define a patch. Really, space between trees is vital to the function of that habitat, right? Garry oaks don't grow in shade, and the native herbaceous understory doesn't grow in shade. So you need open areas in between. And so I feel the line should be drawn in a way where it includes gaps, and that would easily push this site past that threshold.
A couple other things that jumped out to Brandon was that they acknowledged that there were multiple consultants that went out to assess the site. The first consultant that went out actually did feel that it fit the definition of priority habitat. The next year, the developer paid a second consultant to go back out, and they found it did not, right? So, very suspicious. Another defining characteristic of priority oak woodland habitat is size of the trees, and can also include the spread of the canopy of particular trees at a site. We felt like some of these trees at the site were pretty massive, and when trees become old, they develop cavities from failures of branches, right? And that is also a defining criterion is decay characteristics, which are ideal for cavity nesting species.
That decay doesn't make them defective, it doesn't devalue them, it makes them more valuable to other species. Those may not be human species, but they are part of the system, right? And the report stated that there were 0 cavities, and we did find one. We actually did find one cavity that wasn't covered in ivy.
What would you call that? Because I think I would call that a cavity right there. What do you think?
Yeah, man. Cavity. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, totally.
And again, right, those trees were devalued due to the presence of ivy. And, we both know we spend a lot of time fighting ivy, and it's doable. It requires some elbow grease, but restoration practitioners in the Northwest have been fighting ivy successfully for many years.
Lastly, something worth discussion is adjacent land use. Brandon uses the example of a wetland, another type of environmentally critical area. One is required to look at or for the entire wetland system, despite the imaginary of the property lines that wetland might cross. because the animals and the plants don't see those property lines in the ecosystem services provided by the wetlands. This also goes for imagining an oak woodland that has been broken up by parcelization. The smaller and smaller pieces over time become less valuable per the perverse logic of capitalism. This was a concept described by Candace Fujikane a couple episodes ago when we discussed mapping abundance. So at this 123rd Street Oak Grove / potential warehouse site, there was county property across the street adjacent where Garry oaks were growing. Brandon felt that whole area should be valued as part of the oak complex.
Yeah, the code is a huge area. There's huge room for improvement, but I also think in these urbanizing parts of Puget Sound, we need to be thinking more about funding green space, right? So maybe that's acquisition, maybe that's staffing, but maybe we should also be talking to city council about just prioritizing this space differently. So instead of this being slated for warehouse development, maybe there's some mechanism for green space acquisition.
Without tree cover, we know cities can heat up in the summer. In late July, we felt a massive week-long heat wave where daily temperatures were up in the high 80s and into the 90s and reached triple digits. Not only are days hotter when the sun is out, the elevated sustained nighttime temps can be dangerous for people and trees alike. If you all remember back last year to the Tree Hugger episode with Vivek Chandas, he mentioned street-level heat mapping campaigns that are ongoing. Looking at maps from the Tacoma heat campaign as well as separate satellite-derived heat maps, one can see a heat island hovering over Lakewood, only mediated by the cool temps around the lakes in nearby Puget Sound. I will link to these maps in the show notes along with the Earth Economics Heat Island analysis from 2020. The Earth Economics modeling estimates that 3 to 15 lives are lost in the city each year due to extreme heat exacerbated by urban heat islands. The public health burden of urban heat islands is disproportionately levied on the lowest income households. Despite all the oak loss, there is a glimmer of oak restoration happening in Lakewood in what the city refers to as Creekside PDD. I have no idea what PDD means. I looked it up. I can't find it anywhere. Sorry, it's an inaccessible acronym. Anyway, land set aside here is Flet Creek, a wetland complex that serves stormwater services and adjacent protected Garry oak trees. The land and water is technically owned by Clover Park Technical College, which is part of the Flet Creek Research Park, where I sat and talked with Christina Minetti. She introduced me to Derek Faust, who is an instructor in the Environmental Sciences and Technology program at the college. He has a fledgling plan to restore the oak grove.
The history of the site is interesting. So it is 115-acre property. The oaks are probably about, I would say, 20 acres. A good chunk of it, 80 acres, is a wetland. So the Flet Dairy, which had ownership of the property historically, they would use this part of the property, I believe, to my knowledge, as grazing land. We have dairy grasses, so we don't really have the native grasses that we would expect in an oak savanna. And of course, not this, the Scotch broom does not belong here. But they operated for close to 100 years. The college obtained it, and it's a great learning laboratory.
So we walked over here from the college, and you have this cart. There was like 18-gallon jugs in it. So what was that, like 8 pounds a piece, right?
Yeah. So 8 pounds a piece. I think I figured it we're right around at least 120, 130 pounds. And we don't have a water source that I can get to over here, but right now the best way to get water over here for anything that we plant is hauling it over, and summertime is really the most critical time for us to be watering.
So on the edge of the mature Garry oak stand, Dr. Faust explains to me how these little baby Garry oaks were planted in late season, maybe mid-March, by one of his student interns. And they got some spring rains, but really require establishment watering to help them get their roots under them. They're still fairly small trees. Probably the tallest of these newly planted trees are about 12 inches or so. So with some watering, we can expect that they have some pretty decent roots for that size, but they're certainly not deep enough to really grab any water during this droughty summer season. Derek and I thought we might as well tag team the watering expedition. So as Derek instructed me, we did about a half gallon of water on each tree, each baby plant. So what he said was maybe more like an ideal situation was to get a 1,000-gallon cistern or water tank like they have in the U's on other parts of the college property. If he could get a tank installed and filled on the oak grove, then he could just pump water out of there or gravity flow it to the trees that need it. So in this warming world, a lot of thought goes into watering newly established plants.
All right, so half gallon, I'm gonna put a half gallon on this guy. You got this guy right here on his own.
So I don't water those guys.
And you think they're gonna make it on their own?
He's looking, I know that they look
Yeah.
rough, but they come back every year.
Okay.
So as you might know, but oaks are pretty slow growing trees. So even these little guys that have naturally germinated and are starting to grow as little seedlings, these guys have probably been here for, I would say, 2 or 3 years.
I think this one though has some yellow leaves, so I'll put extra on them.
The ones that have a little bit of brown, it was starting to die back, but with watering it again, there's more green leaves coming out.
You have to water deeply, in the middle of summer, I think, to keep them going. Or shift composition, I guess, to species that do better, I guess, in warmer climates, given the range of the Garry oak. And I think it is a climate change winner, along with madrone. Let's see if we can talk about madrone a little bit more. I think these are the ones I feel like are native species that are most drought tolerant.
I think so also. Now, I don't foresee the other species necessarily going anywhere. I think they'll be able to have enough flexibility and phenotypic plasticity, right? Really big word, but basically meaning that they're resilient enough as a species that I think they'll be able to survive long term. But I do agree that oaks and madrone seem most well suited. Oaks actually like soils that drain really well. They don't like their roots to get incredibly wet.
In a warmer, drier future, our tree species will experience increased water stress, and their survival will depend on adaptations to water limitation. Oaks are climate change winners, from my perspective, and have coordinated drought-tolerant strategies and traits. Garry oaks have tough, durable foliage or somewhat waxy cuticle, which perform dual functions of cutting down on water loss and reflecting heat away from the plant. The Garry oaks have vascentric tracheids, which may assist in keeping large vessels hydrated during periods of water shortage. Oaks are water use efficient and respond rapidly to rain by increasing sap flow and photosynthesis. Their roots have ecto and endomycorrhizal associations, which are also essential to forming drought tolerance and relationships with other nearby trees. We have unpacked a lot during this short oak novella. Displacement of neighborhoods in favor of economic development, belonging and loss we feel for Garry oaks, how permitting of pollution and degradation takes place, the heat we currently feel from the lingering fingerprints of racism and colonialism. I think we all know that restoration is hard work and takes a long time, but it's worth it. But there are centuries-old trees that are not being protected in a way commensurate with their value. They're being destroyed with the capitalistic stamp of approval, or at worst, under threat of a tiny fine.
Why is the city allowing developers to circumvent our need for these irreplaceable trees in this city? No monetary fine is enough to compensate for the loss of our grove of Garry oaks.
So what will come next for the city of Lakewood? We know one thing is for certain: the heat is not going to let up. Want to join this effort? Here are some ways to plug in. Number 1, if you want to learn more about oaks of the Cascade Prairies, read about them and become a member of the Cascade Prairie Oak Partnership. At least join the CPOP listserv. Number 2, trees save lives. Research your community's canopy cover, the needs of people in neighborhood heat islands, and demand that your town meet Tree City standards when it comes to tree protection and care. Number 3, Get involved with the good trouble of oak protection in Lakewood by connecting with the Lakewood Garry Oak Conservancy and vote for pro-environmental candidates this fall. 4. Watch September 21st Tacoma Tree Foundation webinar, Garry Oak Restoration with Brandon Drucker. One can find it at the Tacoma Tree Foundation YouTube channel. All these links and more are in your show description, in your app, and on the treehuggerpod.com website. Thanks for finding Tree Hugger Podcast again and tuning into this discussion with all the oak advocates and those fighting for environmental justice. Big thanks to Amelia Escobedo, Christina Manetti, Brandon Drucker, and Derek Faust for recording conversations with me. I am also grateful to those whose voices you heard testifying at the City Council meeting too. In addition to providing his voice for this episode, Brandon Drucker was also essential for production. You can now donate to the show. At the Tree Hugger website, there is a PayPal and now Venmo link. My handle is @myadrick. The equipment and software subscriptions needed to keep this show running are not cheap. If you enjoy the content or if you think the conversations are important for folks to hear around the world, please pitch in a little. It takes a community to keep the podcast going.
I'm a lumper. Are you a splitter or a lumper?
I'm definitely a lumper when it comes
dude.
to
So
habitat
am I.
continuity. Yeah.
So am I. Some of my coworkers, though, splitters. I just like shrug my shoulders, like, you know I'm gonna say. You know what I.